Skill 1 is all about seams. I'm going to walk you through 5 different seam examples. Let's get started. Here are the supplies you're going to need for Skill 1. You're going to want some fabric, woven, right side determinant, some pins, possibly. You don't have to use them, but I will show you how to. A seam gauge, some thread snips, and a handy dandy seam ripper. We hope you don't have to use it, but it's always good to have it around. We're going to start Skill 1 by cutting our fabric swatches. We need 9 swatches that are 4 by 9 and 1 swatch that is 3 by 9. So I'm going to start, I have my fabric here. The yardage, the lengthwise of the fabric is going this way, like the yardage, and then this is the entire width of the fabric. So selvage to selvage. What I want you to do is, we have this cut edge up here. It's always really not straight. So what I'm going to ask you to do is snip along the edge of your selvage a few inches in, and then you're going to rip it. Snip and rip is a great way to get our woven fabric so it has an edge that is straight with the cross grain or the lengthwise grain. So snip and rip. All right, now we have a nice straight edge to start off with. Since our swatches are all 9 inches long, what I want you to do is measure down the selvage 9 inches and snip and rip again. Woohoo! You should have a swath of fabric that is 9 inches by the width of your fabric. What I'm going to do is I'm going to measure 4 inches, snip, and keep doing that until I have 9 sections that are 4 inches wide, and then I'm going to have 1 section that is 3 inches wide. We're going to do the same thing, snip and rip. This is a really easy way to get quick rectangles or quick fabric swatches cut from your fabric. You should have 9 swatches that are 4 by 9, 1 swatch that is 3 by 9. You may have a little bit of extra. You can save that for practicing on or another skill sample. And then hopefully you've cleaned all of these little bits up and you can toss this. Next, I want you to go and serge 1 long edge of each of these swatches. You do not have to serge an edge of this one, but serge 1 long edge on each of these 4 by 9 swatches, and then meet me back here. So this is what you should have after you serge 1 long edge of each of these. I want you to take all 10 of your swatches and just give them a good press. Don't forget to use your handy dandy steam button. We really just want them to look nice, flat, crisp, clean. It'll make the sewing step so much easier. All right, so the first seam we're going to do together for Skill 1 is a plain seam. This is an example of what it should look like. We're looking for a consistent 5/8 inch seam allowance. I want it to be nicely pressed open, and I want the serged edges of your swatches to be the ones that get sewn together, okay? I'm looking for a really smooth, continuous stitch line, back stitch at the beginning and the end. I want you to take 2 of your 4 by 9 fabric swatches. You'll notice that your fabric should be right side determinant. That's what I asked you to get for this course. So what I mean by right side determinant is that it has a right side and a wrong side. And hopefully you can see the difference between the two. The right side usually has some sort of printing or motif or whatever on it, and the wrong side is the wrong side. It's a little bit faded out. I would say something like 95% of sewing is going to be plain seams, okay? And what I mean by plain seams is just two pieces of fabric, put right sides together, sewn, backstitch, beginning and end, okay? In this course, we're going to default to 5/8 inch seam allowances. So if it's not otherwise directed, just assume 5/8 inch seam allowance. And what I mean by that is that your stitch line is 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of your fabric. So to get started with our plain seam, I'm going to have you take 2 fabric swatches, put them right sides together, and so the right sides of the fabric are touching, and align your serged edges. Not only do you want them to be in alignment this way, but you also want them to be in alignment this way. So I want these 2 serged edges very nicely lined up. If you want to use pins, this is where you would use them, and I have shown you how to use pins probably by now. I'm not going to be using pins in my demonstrations, just to save time, but feel free to use them wherever you feel the need. So again, to start off with, we're putting our fabric swatches right sides together. I'm going to use my knee lifter down here to lift up my presser foot and just place my 2 fabric swatches in there so that the edge of my fabric is right in line with the 5/8 inch mark on the bed of our machine. And I'm putting it so this short end of my fabric swatches is sort of in alignment with the back of the presser foot. Because what we want to do is we want to start off by going backwards and then forwards. That helps us lock our stitches in so they won't come out. This is the reverse lever on our machine. Anytime you hold it down firmly all the way, it is going to sew in reverse. When you let it up, it will go back to sewing forward, okay? So we are going to start off by reversing, stitching a consistent 5/8 inch down the swatches. So we get to the end and we are going to reverse again. So hold your reverse lever down and you're going to back stitch kind of to the end of your fabric swatches. You really need, like, I say 4 to 5 back stitches. And then as I'm sewing, I am not watching what the needle's doing. The needle knows what it's doing. You don't need to watch it. You need to watch, and what you have control of is that this edge of your fabric is staying in alignment with your 5/8 inch mark, okay? Go as slow as you need. If you get off course, just steer your fabric back in to alignment with the 5/8 inch mark. Stop every once in a while and make sure that your swatches are still lined up. Once you get to the end of your swatch, you're going to hold your reverse lever and reverse about 4 or 5 stitches. Now, this next part is one of the best sewing habits that you can get yourself into. It will create a much more successful sewing experience for you. So please, please take this seriously. Before any time you are done sewing, I need you to turn your hand wheel in the direction of this arrow until this thread uptake lever is in the highest position, okay? So I'm turning the hand wheel in the direction of the arrow. I don't know if you can see this, until this guy, my thread uptake lever, is in the highest position. Once you've done that, you are free to lift your presser foot up and pull your project out, okay? Cut your thread tails. And you should have something like this. Pretty consistent 5/8 inch seam allowance. And when you open your fabric swatches up, the right side of your fabric is nice and crisp and clean with the seam visible. The wrong side of the fabric is the one that has your seam allowances. Let's go press this now. Pressing is so important in sewing. It's probably like 50% of sewing, actually. After every single sewing step, I recommend you press. Press, press, press. All right, one really deep quote I love to tell my students, it's so true though, is that good pressing can save bad sewing, but bad pressing can ruin good sewing, okay? Think on that. Okay, so my rules for pressing are that I always press as I sewed it, which means I put it flat into my machine like this, so I'm going to press it right like this. And then you go and you press your seams open or you press them to one side or whatever. We are gonna default to pressing our seams open unless the instructions tell us otherwise. So to press this open, I want you to grab your 2 fabric swatches and open those bad boys up, put them face down on your ironing board, and you're gonna take your seam allowances and kind of press them open with your finger. This is called finger pressing, and it can kind of just get a crease started. It's not gonna like form a deep crease, but it can kind of help you keep those laid open. Then I like to take the tip of my iron and just kind of start on one end and slide it through. Steam, steam, steam. Now I'm going to mimic a pressing issue that I really want to drive home to you. So let's say you pressed, and you had sort of this like little fold of fabric. Can you see that? I do not like that. I don't want that. As you're feeling your seam, you'll notice that that creates a little bit of extra bulk and it's not fully pressed open. So I want you, anytime you press like this, it may look like you did a great job on this side. This side's nicely pressed open. You flip it over here, and if you have like a fold or a crease, I want you to repress it. So grab your swatches, really open them up, and use the weight and the heat and the steam to get everything nicely opened and pressed flat, okay? So this is what your finished plain seam sample should look like. Nice, consistent 5/8 inch seam allowance, pressed open, lovely, lovely. Good job. Let's move on to our basted seam sample. The second seam sample we're gonna do for skill 1 is a basted seam. Now this is the same as a plain seam pretty much, except you have a longer stitch length. I'll show you how to do that. I want you to look right about here on your sewing machine, right by the word Juki. There is this beautiful dial right here, and it's numbered 0 through 5. Yours should be set at 2.5 from doing the plain seam sample. 2.5 stitch length is the standard stitch length we use. When in doubt, use 2.5. If you are basting, again, I said the only difference between a plain seam and a basted seam is the stitch length. I want you to turn that bad boy all the way up to 5. The longer the stitch length, the easier it is to take out later. So if we know this is a temporary seam, we're gonna use a longer stitch length. All right, so make sure your dial is turned up to 5, and we are gonna sew our swatches together the exact same way we did for a plain seam. We are gonna take 2 fabric swatches, and we are gonna put them right sides together with the long serged edges in alignment. Really take your time getting those lined up. Again, I don't want to see anything like this, and I definitely don't want you to accidentally be doing anything like this, where the bottom one is not in alignment, or you won't be sewing it together, and you'll have to take it apart. So really make sure these edges are in alignment. We're going to do the exact same process as our plain seam. You're going to put your fabric swatches underneath here, get the edge aligned with your 5/8 inch line, press your foot down. Again, we are going to back stitch at the beginning, stitch a consistent 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way down, and then you're going to back stitch a little at the end, okay? The only difference is every stitch, your fabric is going to advance forward a little bit faster because your stitch length is longer, okay? So hold your reverse lever all the way down, reverse to the end of your fabric swatches, and then go forward all the way down your swatches. This can feel a little bit more chaotic because it's advancing forward faster, but you got this, you can do it. stitch all the way to the end and reverse 4 or 5 stitches. Again, I cannot stress this to you enough. The best sewing habit you can get into is when you're done sewing, stop, grab your hand wheel right here. There should be an arrow pointing downward on it. You are going to pull your hand wheel down until your thread uptake lever is in its highest position, okay? You'll notice that there are arrows over here on the hand wheel, and there should be an arrow right here by your thread uptake lever going up. These go down because that's how you turn the hand wheel. This one goes up because you turn the hand wheel until that thread uptake lever right here, this thing, is in the highest position, okay? Once you got that, you can lift your presser foot up, pull your project out, and trim your thread tails. Another good habit to get into is right when you trim these thread tails, go back to the beginning of your stitch and trim your thread tails there. I do not like thread tails. They make your project so messy. Finish your work, cut your thread tails. All right, what's the next step? What do we always do after sewing something? Press it. Meet me at the pressing table. Our standard procedure for pressing is to always just press as it was sewn. This is just like kind of a jacuzzi, a little sauna for your seam line you just stitched. Kind of gets it melded into the fibers of the fabric. Default is to press our seam allowances open. That's what we're gonna do. So you open your swatch up, face down on your ironing board, kind of finger press these seam allowances open, and then use the weight, the heat, and the steam of your iron to get these really nice and flat and pressed open. Now notice that I'm not going crazy like this with my iron. I'm not going crazy. I want to be gentle and slow and smooth. That's how you're less likely to create creases and wrinkles in your fabric. All right, once you got that pressed open, I always like to flip it over, check and make sure the other side is pressed open nicely. Give it another good press if needed. And that, my friends, is a finalized basted seam. All right, I'm really trying to zoom in. This is my basted seam sample. This is my plain seam sample. I hope you can see the differences. This has a longer stitch length. The machine advances forward more with each stitch. This one has a shorter stitch length. This is what 95% of your sewing is going to look like. Again, a basted seam is just for temporarily holding things in place. Next up, we have stitch in the ditch. Now, this is a technique used to hide stitch lines. So maybe you don't want top stitching, maybe you don't want that look on your garment, but you still need to stitch something to help like enclose some seams or just to stabilize it. So this is how we hide a stitch line in a seam. Now we are going to pretend we're going to take our smaller swatch, our 3x9, and one of our larger swatches, 4x9, and we're going to pretend the smaller swatch is the waistband of a skirt and the larger swatch is the skirt, okay? So you'll see that this is sort of mimicking a waistband on top of our skirt. On the front side, you really can't see much stitching. If I zoom in, you should be able to see that there is a line of stitching actually in that seam of where I attach the waistband to the skirt. And if I flip it to the back side, you can see that that line of stitching helps catch this bottom edge of the waistband and keep everything nicely enclosed. So again, nice clean look, no extra top stitching on the front, and everything is neat and clean and enclosed on the back. So you'll notice in this stitch in the ditch sample that what we're actually doing in this process is a bunch of plain seams, but we're adding in a few extra little techniques to liven up your skills, okay? I want you to take your smaller 3x9 swatch and a 4x9 swatch. And I want you to put them right sides together. We're gonna put them right sides together along the long edges that are unserged, okay? How I like to do that is I like to lay my two pieces next to one another where they're gonna get sewn together, and then just flip one over on top of the other. That's how you can get right sides together. We're gonna be doing a plain seam down this long edge of our swatches. Again, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and the end. Plain seam. Ooh, don't forget your stitch length dial. It's probably still up at 5 from our basted seam. Make sure you turn that bad boy down to 2.5. All right, let's sew. I made sure my two fabric swatches are aligned on these unserged edges. I'm lining the edges up with my 5/8 inch seam on the bed of my machine, my 5/8 inch measurement on the bed of my machine. I'm gonna start by reversing, stitching all the way down. Stop every once in a while, make sure everything is still in alignment. Once I get to the end, I'm going to reverse. Again, before you take your project out of the machine, turn your hand wheel until this comes up to its highest position, and then take your project out. Cut your thread tails and meet me over at the pressing board. Like always, we are going to press as we sewed it. Get that stitch line all melded into the fabric. Now, our instructions tell us to take and press our swatches open, or press our seam allowances open. So pull your swatches out, finger press your seam allowances, and then go in with the iron. After we press our seam allowances open, the next thing our instructions tell us to do is to grade our seams. Now, grading seams is mostly to help reduce bulk within areas of our garment, especially where our seams are enclosed within something like a waistband, okay? So grading seams is, I want you to take this seam allowance of your smaller swatch. And what you're gonna do is you are going to trim half of the width off of it. So now you'll see that one of your seam allowances is really narrow and one is still at the standard 5/8 of an inch. What we're gonna do next is we are going to press both of our seam allowances towards our smaller swatch, our waistband. So what I like to do is use the weight of the iron, pull my swatch this way, and let the iron shove the seam allowances that way, towards the waistband. Same thing, make sure my swatches stay opened and let the weight of the iron push your seam allowances towards the waistband. Now, after you do that, you'll notice that your seam allowances have this sort of tiered effect, and that's what helps reduce the bulk, okay? So grading seams is all about reducing bulk. Now that we have our seam allowances pressed towards our waistband, I want you to get out your seam gauge. This is a seam gauge, kind of looks like a ruler on one side, and it almost always has this little sliding marker. What we're gonna do is I want you to set that sliding marker at 1/2 inch, okay? That should be right in between 0 and 1. And you're gonna take this top edge of our waistband and we are going to fold it down to the wrong sides 1/2 inch and press it in place. So the way that you utilize this seam gauge is that when you fold your fabric down, you hold the seam gauge up and you can tell whether you have it folded properly There. Now I can see that I have my fabric folded down 1/2 inch, so I can go ahead and press that. What I like to do is sort of utilize it slowly all along that edge. And once I'm done, I'm gonna go back and check and make sure that I've folded it down a consistent 1/2 inch. I'm happy with that. I like that. All right, the next step we're gonna do is we're gonna take this folded edge and we're gonna fold it to the wrong side again and press it again. But what I want you to do is I want you to take this folded edge and make sure that it covers your stitch line. It just covers your stitch line. And it should extend about 1/8 of an inch past your stitch line, okay? So again, we're taking this folded edge and we're folding it to the wrong side and making sure that it covers that stitch line by about 1/8 of an inch. And then we're gonna press it in place, okay? Again, taking this folded edge, making sure it covers that stitch line, pressing it in place. Now, once you get done with that, I want you to go and check it and make sure that it's a pretty consistent width on this side. And when you flip it over from the seam line to your fold, should also be a really consistent width, okay? Now we are ready to actually stitch in our ditch. So we've gotten our waistband sewn to our skirt. We graded our seams and got them pressed up towards the waistband. We folded our raw edge under and then folded it again. Now, all of this folding and pressing that we did was so that we could prevent the inside of our waistband from having a raw edge of fabric. That's kind of what we're always doing with our seam finishes, like serging helps prevent a raw edge. Double folding fabric under helps prevent raw edges. So that's the point of that. We also made sure we graded our seams, just trimming to create this tiered effect on our seam allowance, just to help reduce a little bulk, because once we get our waistband folded over, you'll notice that there are quite a few layers in there. All right, so for stitching in the ditch, you can use pins to help pin your waistband creases in place if you would like. Or if you're not going to use pins, just make sure that your waistband, as you're sewing it, stays folded exactly where you pressed it, okay? We're going to do a plain seam again. We're going to reverse at the beginning, stitch all the way down right on that seam line, and then reverse at the end. Now so when you put it under your presser foot, instead of worrying about where this edge of our fabric is, make sure that you put your presser foot down so your needle will hit right on that seam. I'm going to start by reversing, and as I'm stitching all the way down, not only am I making sure that my waistband stays folded where it's creased, but I'm also going to use my fingers to kind of pull apart this seam on either side so I can really see that my stitches are getting right on that seam, okay? So I'm going to reverse. I'm so sorry if my head gets in the way, but I really got to see to do this. And I'm kind of pulling my swatches apart to really get my stitches right in there. Now, you want to make sure that you did a really good job of pressing on our last step. Make sure that that folded edge was covering that stitch line so that you are actually going to be catching that folded edge as you're doing this. And I'm using a contrasting thread, so you're probably still going to be able to see it, but normally we would use a matching thread and it would be really hidden within that seam line. Once I get to the end, I'm gonna reverse. I'm gonna use my hand wheel to make sure this thread uptake lever is in the highest position, and then I can pull my project out. Of course, we're gonna press it. So meet me over at the ironing board and I will show you kind of a close-up of what we got. This is what your stitch in the ditch sample should look like once you've got it sewn. On the front, it's pretty clean. We have a waistband, our skirt, and then depending on the thread color you chose, you might be able to see the faintest stitch line in there. On the back, what I really want you to check and make sure is that you caught that folded edge all the way along. And that's why it's great to have such precision and take your time in the pressing stage. It will make the sewing part easier. Again, I just sewed this. It's a bit wonky. I'm gonna go and press it. From the front side and the back. Now, as a beginner, this is a really tough technique to get, especially getting those stitches right in that seam all the way down. Try your best. If you get a few little stitches up and down on your waistband and then on your skirt, it's okay. I'm mostly worried about is your stitch line mostly hidden? And did you catch your folded edge on the back side? If so, you're great. If you didn't catch your folded edge on the back side, or your stitch line is entirely on your waistband the whole time, go back, use your seam ripper, and try again, okay? But this should be your finished stitch in the ditch sample. Let's move on to French seam. Our fourth seam sample for skill 1 is going to be the French seam. French seams are really interesting in that they are made up of 2 lines of stitching. Their seam allowances are entirely enclosed, which makes them great for really lightweight, delicate, or even sheer fabrics. And another interesting thing is that you start with the fabrics wrong sides together. In fact, this always messes me up, because I have such muscle memory of putting fabrics right sides together. So remember, French seams always start with wrong sides of the fabric together. Let's go over to the machine and get started. This is a finished example of a French seam. From the right side, you just see your 2 swatches and a seam line. From the back side, you'll see you kind of have this narrower seam allowance where the edges are enclosed within it. You're going to need 2 of your 4x9 swatches. And again, we're starting with the wrong sides together. So I want you to take, and we're stitching the unserged edges of these, okay? I want you to take and put your fabric swatches, kind of always lay them right next to each other, and then wrong sides together, okay? See how this is the right side of my fabric, and then I have the wrong sides touching. That's how we want it. Let me get my thread tails under my presser foot and out of the way. Really make sure that these unserged edges are in alignment. Now, our French seam is made up of 2 separate seams, so we end up stitching twice. So when we add those 2 separate seam allowances together, we want them to equal 5/8. So our first seam allowance is going to be 1/4 of an inch. Our second seam allowance is going to be 3/8 of an inch. 1/4 plus 3/8 is 5/8. Lovely. All right, so when you're looking at the bed of your machine, this first line on the right of your presser foot is the 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? So you're gonna kind of line the edge of your fabric up with that. And again, we're doing 2 separate plain seams. So what you're used to, just back stitch at the beginning, sew the length of the fabric swatches at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then back stitch at the end, okay? The next step we're going to do is I'm going to have you take and just barely trim the edges of these seam allowances down, okay? We just want to trim them down a little bit so that our next seam, these little kind of frayed edges will not peek out. I want you to take this to your ironing board and press it open, okay? This is what you should have once you've pressed it open. You'll see the right side of your fabric and you'll have your little baby seam allowances. They should be pressed open. Now what we're gonna do is we want to now bring our fabric's right sides together. And when you do that, I want you to get that seam right on the very edge. So right on your seam, you're bringing your fabric's right sides together, and that first seam, that first stitch line you have, I want you to get it so it is right on the fold, right on the edge. Now we're gonna do our second seam involved with this French seam. It's gonna be a plain seam again, but we're gonna use a 3/8 inch seam allowance, okay? And again, the folded edge right where your seam line is the edge of your fabric. You're gonna line that up with the 3/8 inch line, which is right between the 1/4 and 1/2 inch measurements on the bed of your machine. It's sort of right where this black guard comes down. So you can kind of line the edge of the fabric up right underneath that black guard. Again, plain seam, back stitch at the beginning, stitch 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way down, back stitch at the end. And as I'm going on this part, I'm constantly going to be making sure that I have that seam, my fabric's folded right sides together with that seam right on my edge, okay? This is what your seam should look like when you've just finished sewing it. You'll see that you have that stitch line right on the edge, and you can't see any raw edges of fabric, which is beautiful. Let's press it as we've sewn it. Then what we're gonna do next is we're gonna open up our swatches. Now, our default is usually to press these seam allowances open, but instead of having two separate seam allowances, we now just kind of have this one. So we're just going to press it to one side. I don't care which side. Use the weight of your iron, pull your fabric swatches open, and let it press the seam allowance to one side. Do it again from this side. Make sure you don't have any like folds in your fabric. You definitely want that nice and open. So this is what your finished front seam is going to look like from the front side. On the back side, you'll see one line of stitching, and it'll be this sort of one enclosed seam allowance. Beautiful. Let's move on to flat felled seams now. This is a finished example of a flat felled seam. Now you'll notice on the front, you'll see two lines of stitching, and they're very nice and consistent distance from one another. On the back side, you will see a seam and one line of stitching. Flat felled seams are commonly found in like really rugged outerwear or sportswear. You'll often find them in jeans, denim, and canvas often. Denim and canvas garments are often made using flat felled seams. They're really sturdy because they have two lines of stitching. They're similar to a French seam in that all of the raw edges of the fabric are enclosed within the seam. And they are also similar to French seam in that you start with your two fabric swatches wrong sides together. Let's get started. You should be taking your last two fabric swatches. You're gonna place them wrong sides together, aligning the unserged edges. And you're gonna do a plain seam all the way down the long edge of it, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. we're gonna press as it was sewn, like always. And then press your seam allowances open. You see how time and again we're doing the same kind of things over and over again. I promise you that the more you sew, the more the muscle memory will kind of kick in. But be sure to always check your directions. All right, we've got our seam allowances pressed open. You're going to take one of these seam allowances and you're gonna grade it, so to say. You're gonna trim half of the width off of it. It doesn't matter which one, just pick one and grade it. When you grade this seam allowance, you should trim it down to a 1/4 inch, okay? If you need to give yourself a visual guideline, go ahead and do so. Use a ruler and a marking tool and mark where a 1/4 inch width would be, and then you can trim it along that line, or just trim it in half. It'll be close enough. Now you're gonna take and you're gonna press your longer seam allowance over the top of the narrow one that you just trimmed. So now both of your seam allowances are pressed to one side. This next step can be kind of tricky, so follow along with me. What we're gonna do next is we're essentially doing the part where we're enclosing all of our raw edges. We're gonna take this longer seam allowance we have, it's pressed over the top of the shorter one. We're gonna take the raw edge of it and fold it under and around that shorter seam allowance. So it's kind of encasing it like this. You see that? And then we're gonna press. When you do this, I want you to take your time. You can even use your seam gauge if needed to make sure that this, when you fold it under and around that smaller seam allowance, that you're getting a really consistent width on it, okay? So do that all the way down. So this is what it should look like when you're done. You'll see that my raw edge is folded down and around that narrow seam allowance, and then it's pressed over to one side. There should be no raw edges visible anymore, and this should be a pretty consistent width all the way down, okay? Let's go meet back at our sewing machine. So we got our French seam to where it's folded under and all of our raw edges are enclosed. So the last step we need to do is we need to edge stitch really close to this folded edge, and that's just gonna kind of enclose everything and finalize this. That's giving us our secondary stitch line on the seam, which is what helps make it really sturdy and rugged. Before we start sewing, I want you to look at your presser foot. It has these two sort of toes on it. We'll call them toes, fingers or toes, whatever. What I want you to do is this folded edge, it might be on the right side or it might be on the left side for you. It doesn't matter which side it's on. I want you, when you put your project under your presser foot, I want you to align that folded edge just to the inside of one of these toes, okay? Edge stitching is stitching that is really close to a folded edge. So that's how you make sure that your stitching is a really consistent distance from this folded edge. Just align that folded edge with the inside of one of these toes, okay? Same thing, you're doing a plain seam, so you're reversing at the beginning, carefully stitching all the way down and reversing at the end. Take your time, go slow, and make sure you're definitely catching that folded edge. You don't want to drift off of it. Make sure you're catching that folded edge and you're staying a consistent distance from the folded edge. And as long as you pressed well, your two lines of stitching should be a really consistent distance from one another by the time you're done. I hope you realize throughout this skill that if you're not happy with your work, try pressing it. Because sometimes when you press it, you'll really see that it adds a nice refinement to the work you've done, and it really just creates a nice clean, polished look to everything. So when in doubt, press. This is what your finalized flat felled seam should be. You need to cut a little thread tail. Again, you'll see two lines of stitching on the front. They should be a nice consistent width from one another. You should have definitely caught that folded edge with your second line of stitching. Then on the back side, you'll see a seam and one line of stitching. And again, it should be a fairly consistent distance from one another.